What is your favorite game of all time? What do you feel is the weakest part of that game? How much better would the game be if that part of the game was tweaked, fixed, or entirely cut out? Congratulations, you just did something that many game designers regularly do when they set out to define the idea for their own game. You took a game and you used its influence to create a new and interesting idea with your personal touch. In fact, this isn't something only game designers do. Take the oldest piece of media you can think of with a certain theme and see how many stories have spawned in the years, decades, or even centuries since that original piece of media appeared. When authors, directors, musicians, artists, comedians, and so on talk about the works and people that influenced them, what they're saying is that their brains consumed a piece of media and ideas for new pieces of media came out. So you probably looked at the title of this video, saw the words Four Kings Review, and are wondering what the hell I'm talking about. Fire Emblem ROM hacks are, in a sense, their own creative works, with Fire Emblem as a major influence, to the point that the ROM hack relies on an underlying engine of the original game. So in analyzing any ROM hack, the Four Kings included, we have to also analyze the foundation of the Fire Emblem series, its gameplay, its narrative, its creative direction, and draw comparisons and conclusions. So it begins, my review of the Four Kings by KrashBoomBang. We should start with explaining what the Four Kings actually is. It's a ROM hack of the Sacred Stones, a total conversion of the base game, adding an entire cast of new characters, a unique narrative, and some extra mechanics, which we'll touch on in a bit. The game is set in the world of Ibril, a setting that's quite similar to many Fire Emblem worlds. A single continent with nations that have been to war with one another in the past, but now exist in varying degrees of diplomatic tension. It's the kind of tense setting where war could break out at any moment. The game's main characters are Walter and Lionel, two brothers and princes of one of Ibril's kingdoms, Askia. They don't get along, but are sent off on a diplomatic mission to Askia's rival nation, Behanzin, to try and normalize relations. Good and bad things happen throughout the game's 29 chapters, and you'll probably get at least 30 to 40 hours of playtime out of the hack if you're playing casually and reading the story. The first thing I'll touch on is the aesthetics of the hack, since it's the first thing you notice. There are some good musical choices, especially during key dialogue scenes. Sometimes even the lack of music is effective in establishing a scene's mood. But a fair amount of the music, especially enemy phase music, sounds like it was imported incorrectly, either coming out too bassy or too loud. It's kinda weird that more care wasn't put into that, considering the more deliberate musical choices heard throughout the hack. But that's just a heads up that if you play this hack with headphones, expect to ride the volume controls a bit, to not give yourself a headache. I will say that some of the portraits are charming, and I really like some portraits in particular. Sean looks like such a dashing rogue, though others need a bit more touching up to make them more memorable and unique. Fortunately, it seems like portrait improvements and redesigns are underway. I look forward to seeing how the portrait work improves in future patches, or even in another future hack from Crash. Another thing you notice early on is the difficulty selection screen. In labeling difficult mode as the intended difficulty setting, it's fair to say that the game was balanced around difficult mode. But the Four Kings plays much more like a traditional Fire Emblem game's hard mode on normal. On the Four Kings difficult mode, the early chapters, particularly chapters 4, 6, 8, 9, and 10, seem as if they're designed to condition the player on what they should expect from the rest of the hack. We'll get into what there is to expect shortly. That said, most of my gameplay-related commentary in this review applies to difficult mode and the issues surrounding it, because it's labeled as the intended setting. First off, it's worth acknowledging the general design philosophy of the Four Kings appears to be the exact opposite of the general design philosophy in base Fire Emblem games. In base Fire Emblem games, you can play pretty much however you like, but you're rewarded for much more efficient play that allows you to take fewer turns. Whether that means getting some extra loot that an enemy thief would have otherwise run off with, recruiting a unit that will flee the map or die if not reached in time, or simply being able to show off a low turn count at the end of the game. On the other hand, in the Four Kings, any plays that are even slightly inefficient will stop you from being able to progress through the game. Sometimes you don't know you screwed up until late into a chapter, which also goes against the design philosophy of base Fire Emblem games, where most bad situations are at least somewhat salvageable, even late into a chapter. This design philosophy is unintuitive, more punishing than fun. and feels like it is designed to intentionally taunt or frustrate a player for playing a chapter blindly for the first time. Let's continue with the Four Kings character design, since it's going to inform the rest of the commentary on gameplay. The main draw of the hack is that every character has their own personal weapon, and by extension, their own unique purpose. Not every Four Kings character is good, which is fair enough. After all, not every character in regular Fire Emblem games is good. So it's to be expected that the Four Kings will have some underperforming units. In the Four Kings, you want characters that can fit to specific roles doing the work that needs to be done during a specific chapter. This is definitely a unique way to design a Fire Emblem Romhack. It's similar to having unique skills for each character, except those skills have limited usage throughout play, thanks to weapon durability being a thing. The fact that one of your characters has a 5-use hammer and staff as a personal weapon will allow you to repair some of the personal weapons you favor the most. Unfortunately though, the design of many of the game's chapters often clash with how units are designed to be used. Take someone like Vin for example. His gimmick is that his personal weapon, the Man Gauche, gives him a ton of extra avoidance, allowing him to dodge practically any normal enemy attack and the vast majority of boss attacks. So ideally, you want to use him at the front of your party, baiting enemies to him on enemy phase so that your other units can deal with those enemies on player phase. There are two problems with this. The first glaring issue is that almost every chapter places some sort of turn-based pressure on the player. In many chapters, incredibly strong reinforcements appear on turn 8 or turn 12, or whatever, that you have no hope of defeating and must not only avoid for the next 2 to 3 turns, but also complete the chapter within those turns. On a few occasions, mostly towards the end of the game, the chapter outright ends because it just has a turn timer attached to it. So as much as Vin is designed to pull enemies and dodge tank, he's also a waste of valuable time to use. But, since Vin is one of the few characters who can handle being attacked repeatedly on enemy phase, you essentially have to use him. This creates a sort of vicious cycle, where you are constantly up against the clock, trying to use units for the specific purpose they're designed for, while at the same time trying not to use them that way too much for the Romhack creator's designs, lest you run out of time and find yourself facing level 31 generals coming up from behind you in Chapter 9, when your average unit has cardboard defense and an iron or steel weapon if they're lucky. The one saving grace here is that you're at least warned at the start of the chapter about which turn reinforcements will get intense, but typically the turn limitation is too tight to allow for much gameplay variance, and it often feels like there are only a handful of ways to complete a certain chapter. I'd say I'm a pretty experienced Fire Emblem player, having played all of the games and beaten most of them on the highest difficulty settings, but I still know my limitations. Chapter 4 features level 15 mercenary reinforcements with rune swords, when the average level of your party is probably around 4 or 5, and they're pretty tricky to escape if you're not expecting reinforcements in this hack to be super powerful. Chapter 6 features the first promoted boss enemies, as well as a timed puzzle to get a valuable hero crest, when promoted boss enemies usually appear much later in Fire Emblem, and losing out on a hero crest can really prove disadvantageous for keeping up with the hack's difficulty scale. In Chapter 8, you have to properly time some moves, or you may face some inconvenient reinforcements that spam you until there are 50 of them. And if you try to use your tank characters to hold choke points, those characters will just get surrounded, even if it means those reinforcing enemies pass through your units in order to surround them. In Chapter 10, you are forced to deploy literally everyone in your party to defend 2 very long lines of enemy seize points, including the underperforming units you haven't been using up until now, in the hopes of defeating 4 bosses and a horde of enemies trying to capture your flag in 12 turns before the super powerful reinforcements arrive. In difficult mode, I nearly just quit on Chapter 10, because it was one of the most tedious chapters I've ever done in a Fire Emblem game, and I beat Path of Radiance on Maniac mode. Despite the heads up on reinforcements, they feel thrown together, and have no impact on the narrative whatsoever. As a counterexample to this, consider Path of Radiance again, this time Chapter 11, where the Black Knight appears behind you as soon as you touch the boss. That's narratively sensible and makes the race against time more personal. Considering how many characters are in pursuit of your party for much of the game, it's strange that they weren't deployed as hard to defeat reinforcements, instead of a horde of generic enemies. It seems like a waste of narrative tension. It's pretty clear that the horde of generic enemies were added as a way to prevent certain solutions to chapters that the Romhack creator didn't intend for the player to use, which seems very short-sighted, as it turns chapters into a game of trying to read the Romhack creator's mind in order to figure out what the intended solution to the puzzle is. So, let's say you play this hack and give up on Chapter 8 or Chapter 10, two chapters that feature design decisions that really showcase what the rest of the hack features. It's hard to give your opinion on a hack that you, understandably, couldn't be bothered to finish, so you probably don't bother to give feedback. Again, understandably so. Well, I played the whole thing, and I'm going to say up front that it was a learning experience. I wouldn't call the game consistently enjoyable, but the Four Kings had memorable moments where I appreciated some design choices. That said, it also had some god-awful moments where I had to consider whether the hack had been thoroughly tested. The hack's route split in the mid-game effectively divides your party in two, by making half of your party undeployable in each chapter that is part of the route split, which is an interesting way to get the player to use every unit available to them to progress through the game as they jump back and forth between routes. Where this falls flat, unfortunately, is that not every character is particularly useful. I mentioned earlier that it's okay for some characters to be more useful than others, because that's how it is in standard Fire Emblem games. In those games, you get to use the units that are good. The Four Kings, on the other hand, forces you to use the bad units you probably don't want to use in efficient play, as well as the good units that will inevitably do most of the heavy lifting in each chapter. This effect is exacerbated in difficult mode, because of how enemy auto levels work. The enemies will consistently be better than your units, and need to be taken on very slowly, often in small groups, in a similar manner to Three Houses' Maddening mode early game. Whereas in base Fire Emblem games, using bad units can make for an interesting challenge, in the Four Kings they feel more like liabilities that you are forced to dragging along, and something that will pay off with time. In standard Fire Emblem, you have the option not to use these bad units. In the Four Kings, you either use these units, or you leave deployment slots empty for no real benefit. And that points to another glaring issue with the hack, at least theoretically speaking. Every base Fire Emblem game can be Iron Manned because if a unit dies, you have an imperfect replacement who can fill in. A built-in redundancy that Glorious Kaga handed down from the heavens. In Four Kings, this is not really the case. If you lose someone before or during the route split chapters, your teams will be imbalanced, and you will likely struggle with one of the routes due to not having enough characters to cover all the objectives. Not only that, but many characters are crucial to completing each chapter in a timely fashion, which is vital to do in practically every chapter because heavy reinforcements will light a fire under your ass. That said, if you lose any of them and decide to try to proceed with the game, you may effectively soft-lock yourself out of a low turn count solution that also happens to be your only solution to a chapter. The deaths of characters like Finn, the dodge tank, and Shelby, the face tank, would practically make the game an absolute chore and dice roll fest to play, likely 100% unplayable for someone playing casually, and unwilling or unable to manipulate the game's RNG to an excessive degree. Lose Zoe and you lose her hammer and staff, and the ability to repair other units' personal weapons, which will almost certainly put you in a bind by the late mid-game. Lose units that are particularly effective against flyers, like Logritus or Cielo, and you will struggle with chapters that have heavy amounts of flying reinforcements. Lose units that recruit other units through talk conversations, and you lose out on some of the best units in the game, good by their sheer nature of being able to do lots of things instead of being good at just one thing like most other units. A final issue I'll touch on as it relates to the character design in this hack is that player characters have pretty non-standard stat bases and growths for their class, as far as Fire Emblem goes. However, the enemies do appear to have standard stat bases and growths for their classes. This effect is made worse by difficult mode due to how auto levels work, and so lower difficulties give the enemy fewer level ups, they're more on par with your units. In difficult mode, however, each individual enemy unit is, on average, significantly stronger than your units on average. This creates a sort of puzzle where you need to match your units against the enemies they will be most effective against, thanks to their personal weapons and stat-related quirks. You're essentially forced to either play the puzzle and rely on using units that are effective against tough enemies, or break the puzzle by using units that do well in their own right. Because of these requirements, there is very little room for the same level of creativity which base Fire Emblem games can be approached with. You either use the tools you're given correctly and move on to the next chapter, or you don't. Theoretically, you could fix your unit. The Battle Preparations shop offers secret books and goddess icons to boost your character's skill and luck by 2, respectively. They cost 1,000 gold each, but it's important to understand what this actually has the potential to fix. On the screen, you can see some calculations. But in summary, one secret book boosts a character's hit rate by 4%, and a character's critical hit rate by 1%. One goddess icon boosts a character's hit rate by 1%, a void rate by 2%, and reduces the enemy's critical hit rate by 2%. To get anything remotely valuable out of these items, you would have to buy a lot of them and stack them all on one unit. And the only thing you can boost relatively efficiently is your unit's hit rate anyway. Considering you also need to spend money on equipment to use in battle, your money is pretty limited overall, and the silver card is not available until the late game. It's incredibly hard to justify buying these items in bulk in a normal playthrough. There is probably one unit you could make the case for buying these items in a reasonably efficient playthrough, and they're the last unit you ever recruit. That's all I have to say about the gameplay. The narrative of the game is an entirely different beast. This is a spoiler-free review, so if you're concerned about that, don't worry. I'm going to touch on the narrative's construction rather than specific details. To help provide broader context for my criticism of the narrative, we should take a step back and look at a technique that stories often employ, called in medias res. This is a technique where the narrative begins as the plot is ongoing. For example, in Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War, you're put immediately into a siege on Fort Jungbi by Verdane, as Sigurd prepares to ride out to defend the castle and try to save Aidheat. This technique is also used in Sacred Stones, which starts with Grado's attack on Renee and Seth's fight with Walter. You immediately know what the central conflict for most of the story is going to be in both of these scenarios. While in medias res isn't always the perfect choice for starting a story, and Fire Emblem is honestly not the best example of using that technique, it can be a pretty good one for setting up something action-packed. And it's used in a ton of video games you know and love, not just Fire Emblem. The Four Kings doesn't do that, and its effect on the narrative is painfully noticeable. You spend 7 chapters before getting into the meat of the story. The first 7 chapters are spent explaining the history of Ibril, followed by the main characters Walter and Lionel repeatedly getting into fights with bandits. This portion of the game is used to introduce characters but not to advance the narrative much. By chapter 8, you have a fair idea that something has gone wrong, but it isn't really until chapters 9 and 10 that you get a clear picture of the central conflict for most of the story. Considering the game has 29 chapters and 3 of these chapters are battle preps, it's a bit disheartening that a story-focused player will have to spend about 10 to 15 hours on the hack before the meat of the story kicks in. And even when it does get there are glaring inconsistencies scattered throughout the narrative that makes one wonder just how perceptive the characters in the story really are. Even the narratives for each individual chapter seem to falter, especially as the game goes on. Turn limits and battle conditions often feel like contrivances, made-ups that the player will have something the Romhack creator thought would be interesting to play against, rather than because it would have any narrative heft. While a few chapters stand out for being thematically sound in their narrative, like Chapter 7, most just feel extraneous, seemingly added just to pad out the chapter count rather than advance the story in a meaningful way. The narrative between characters, such as in support conversations, trends toward the weak side as well. While there are quite a few interesting interactions between characters and supports, a lot of them are also just characters rattling off their stats and weapon ranks, and hinting at what they'll unlock on promotion, in an in-character fashion. A lot of the time, a Four Kings character's personality is the sum of their abilities, when in reality, personality is not so one-note. And I can't blame Crash for writing some characters this way when base Fire Emblem itself features so many one-note personalities. It's a very easy way to write a side character. But I feel like writers can do a lot better than to emulate base Fire Emblem characters in their writing. While I did like some of the support conversations for being good at establishing a character's personality, others could have been a lot better. Some examples of characters with some well-written supports are Sean, Bradley, Lydia, Locritus, and Dorian. There's a general trend in the writing where support conversations for characters recruited earlier are better written than characters recruited later, generally speaking at least, which leads me to think that more effort was put into characters that will be with your party longer. There's a minor issue with narrative tone in the hack as well. A lot of dialogue feels inappropriately timed or stiff. For example, characters engage in long lectures during scenes where time is very obviously of the essence, or they say flippant things during a scene where the tone is clearly serious. This would be fine if the characters were clearly written as being socially awkward or overly aggressive, but they aren't really established that way. The narrative also struggles with anachronisms. Walter in particular often sounds like he's from the present day, saying things like dude and let's rock, whereas everyone else sounds like they actually belong in the setting. Speaking of the setting, Ibril's an interesting one, and it would be nice to see it explored more. The politics of Ibril make for a solidly compelling setting for a Fire Emblem game, and it would be nice to see either a sequel to the Four Kings story, or a prequel based on Ibril's history, which seems decently fleshed out. The narrative features a pretty diverse cast in terms of gender and sexuality, certainly more than most base Fire Emblem games. Side characters like Harriet, Jack, and Locritus seem to be written pretty responsibly as LGBTQ characters. They're written in a way that doesn't homogenize or tokenize them, and it's worth exploring their supports to find out more about them. But as good as that is, that also makes the lack of significant main character development stand out more. Early in the game, we're introduced to Ava, a character known as the Beautiful Bandit. Rather than being praised for her banditry skill, her title shows that the world mainly expects beauty from women, and her criminality is used purely to add to her feminine allure. She's not like other girls, and thus not like other bandits, so to speak. She is taken prisoner by Lionel, but ultimately allowed to fight alongside the group to be spared execution. Almost immediately afterward, romantic tension builds up between her and Walter, even though the circumstances of Ava's presence aren't exactly consensual. She was captured, after all, and wouldn't even be fighting for Walter's army if Lionel hadn't essentially forced her into it. Later on, in a village in Chapter 5, we meet an older man who will talk about how he enjoys watching Pegasus Knights train in their short skirts. He will tell this to any member of your party, including Marcy, a young Pegasus Knight on your roster. Not a huge deal, just creepy for no apparent narrative reason. I'll avoid narrative spoilers, but later in the game, there is a scene where a high-ranking female character talks about being cooped up in a small room for a long time, but frames it entirely in sexual innuendo for some reason. While it's valid for women to express their sexuality, the way her comments are presented come across as trying to build her sexual allure for other characters and the viewer, while at the same time diminishing the actual hardship of her situation. These bits of dialogue seem to be played for laughs or are written to seem romantic, but there isn't really anything funny or charming about them, and it doesn't add anything to the player's understanding of the setting or how the finer mechanics of the Romhack work. It just comes off as shallow, especially compared to the somewhat deeper writing hidden behind some support conversations. Compare this to base Fire Emblem games, where visiting home and villages always provides information about the narrative or about how to play the game, and where dialogue with characters and cutscenes always conveys something related to the game's plot. In that context, there is a lot of dialogue in the Four Kings that seems extraneous enough to either cut or replace. That said, most of the houses you can visit in the intermission chapter stand out as offering decent contextual information that helps with understanding the rest of the game's plot. I'm just not sure why more bits of dialogue couldn't be like what you see in the houses in Chapter 1, or the intermission chapter, when there was so much room for a narrative development that was wasted on narratively jarring, immature, and frankly poorly written jokes. As a final point on the narrative, it struggles with establishing character agency. I would argue that the main characters seem to be pushed along by the narrative, unable to make most of their own decisions, while at times forcing each other into positions they may otherwise be against taking up. There are characters that just seem like they exist as emotional support for another character. Ava is an example of this, and Lionel as well in his own way. Rather than having an actual deep personality themselves, they exist to prop up the other character and give them something to fight for or protect, or something to disagree with, or otherwise justify their existence. Considering how common emotional support roles fall on female characters in particular in the hack, the narrative seems to lean on the traditional narrative roles of women supporting men, while men get in the way of other men. Though there are a few obvious exceptions, it feels like characters are mostly pushed along by what players expect of the archetype those characters fit into. In conclusion, I would recommend this hack to someone who wants to try something new and Fire Emblem-y, while offering some unique ideas on gameplay, or someone who wants to get some interesting ideas on character design, if not necessarily map design, for a Romhack of their own. You just need to be patient, very patient, if you want to get something out of the intended experience on difficult mode. The gameplay brings forth some interesting ideas, but needs a lot more fine-tuning and more rigorous testing to not seem punishing or dismissive to players with lower skill or different tastes than the Romhack creator. My Let's Play series was done on difficult mode, which I said before was labeled the intended difficulty setting. But I played the first 10 chapters on normal mode off-screen, and found it was a more balanced experience, less prone to the unit's odd stat distributions, and overall quite a bit more fun. It felt a little less tight and a little more free, more like the Fire Emblem games that inspired it than a convoluted puzzle that this hack can often be on difficult mode. The story is a little half-baked, the general concepts and themes are solid, world building is pretty good, but most of the characters and their decisions and perspectives needed a lot more work than they seem to have gotten. That said, I can't recommend playing difficult mode in good conscience, at least not on your first playthrough, unless you have a lot of time to burn or are willing to use save states or RNG rigging techniques to save yourself time. If you're more curious about the story or seeing how gameplay features are implemented, the payoff from playing difficult mode legitimately is not worth the effort, considering the time investment required. And you are better off playing normal mode for an experience that would normally be labeled as hard in Fire Emblem games. If you normally play Fire Emblem on normal, then try Four Kings Easy mode instead. At its best, the Four Kings offers a fresh Fire Emblem experience for people familiar with the series in its entirety, who are willing to either play at a lower difficulty level than they usually do, or push their way through the intended, if not very well balanced, difficulty. At its worst, the Four Kings contains a lot of examples on how certain map design techniques can lead to a stalled gameplay experience, a case study on how unique game design ideas can be overused and ultimately become undervalued. This was admittedly a pretty rough series to get through for a lot of reasons. I will probably revisit this hack after either some significant updates or whenever a sequel happens to come out or something. I think it's worth my time to do that. Remember to like the video if you enjoyed it or learned something from it. Dislike it if you didn't enjoy it or didn't learn anything from it. And subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.